the BBC should cough up.
And we've been responsible for some awful things. Things like the BBC.
But the licence fee will be frozen for the next 2 years.
I mean, its job is to hold power to account.
For over a century, the BBC has been the nation's broadcaster, but at times it can feel like it's never been under so much public scrutiny. And whilst it might be a staple in British homes, it's definitely not strayed away from any controversy. The BBC, and specifically its news coverage, has been on a collision course with politics throughout its history, and it's clashed heads with many different prime ministers. But perhaps its biggest ideological test came whilst Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, a struggle from which we can draw some fascinating parallels to its situation today. But why do some politicians spar with the national broadcaster, and what would life be like if some critics got their way and we didn't have a BBC at all? Let's take a look. Part of the problem is the BBC and governments often have a different view on what the BBC's role should actually be. And this was certainly the case between Margaret Thatcher and the BBC. To understand Margaret Thatcher's relationship with the BBC, we need to look at her own ideology. As a neoliberal free marketeer, Thatcher was at odds with the licence fee system in place for the BBC. She wanted to challenge the comfortable duopoly that the BBC and ITV had over television screens. In one of her first notes as Prime Minister, Thatcher marvelled at the extravagant spending of the BBC. In many ways, it represented the bureaucracy she strived against.
I mean, her relationship with it is contradictory, in essence. She comes in with a very sort of clear market agenda. She's going to market, everything's going to have markets, and the market will clear things up. So the BBC and public service broadcasters more generally look like an intervention in the market, you know, which is subsidised by the state. So that's what one bit of the Thatcher big brain thinks that very clearly. So what you need to do is expose the BBC to more market forces, and the way to do it is to introduce advertising. Another bit of her brain also knows that the BBC is a fantastic British institution. She often comes into conflict with it. Half of her wants to abolish the BBC. She's the first person who's ever really come up with some plan that would get rid of it. And the other half of her just wants more of the BBC, doing more things that she wants them to do. So that's the key bizarre thing in her head, really.
In 1985, she commissioned the Peacock Committee to review BBC financing, but it returned a verdict she might not have expected, that the licence fee was the least worst option. But that was not the end of the story. After the verdict of the Peacock Committee, Thatcher took another tack to tackle the BBC. She did so by adding more Conservative members to the BBC Board of Governors, including Marmaduke Hussey as its chair. Thatcher also fought with the BBC over its editorial policy, something underlined by the perceived left-wing bias of the corporation.
So she thought the media were really important. She thought the BBC was very important. She thought it was opposed to her. I kind of understand. You know, men were very condescending to her. Men, this was a different age, men could be very condescending. They could mansplain to her. And she was very allergic to that, and her whole life was created out of analogies. Most institutions were reduced to quivering sycophancy by Mrs. Thatcher's methods. The BBC was not reduced to quivering sycophancy. That may have made it feel slightly too resistant. I don't think they were biased against her. I think they tried to find, I think they tried to find the handle of the vase they could carry, because the BBC actually does have a very direct relationship to politics.
Presenter Peter Snow came under scrutiny for his reporting of the Falklands War on Newsnight. Indeed, the Thatcher government was outraged when he questioned the reliability of British Army sources live on air. John Page MP described his remarks as almost treasonable. The Troubles also sparked another contentious issue for Thatcher and the BBC. In a speech, Thatcher said that she didn't want the IRA to have the oxygen of publicity. The BBC, as a news organisation, didn't agree. A month after making that very speech, Thatcher learned that the BBC had interviewed a senior Republican soldier for a documentary. The governors called an emergency meeting and ruled that the programme could not go out, causing outrage within the corporation and a day's walkout from the journalists. 1987 saw the resignation of BBC Director General Alistair Milne, who claimed he was forced out by Marmaduke Hussey. He was replaced by John Burt, who was tasked with modernising the corporation. After several other appointments, Thatcher left the BBC in a much more streamlined state, but also one that she found more favourable.
Various prime ministers at various times, ever since the BBC was founded in 1926 in a very difficult moment, including Churchill, who loathed the BBC because the BBC had kept him off the air when he was an anti-appeaser. So he got very good grounds for not liking the BBC, and he personally loathed John Rees, who was a great man, who personally loathed him wrongly. So that, you know, these things are deep down and personal sometimes. But I don't think they'd ever wanted to actually abolish the BBC. And I think that Mrs. Thatcher's idea of funding the BBC by advertising, although she didn't fully grasp the impact, she thought it would make the BBC better, would have abolished the BBC. So there was an existential crisis around Mrs. Thatcher and the BBC. You could say she had her way. I don't think her way, in the end, was terrible for the BBC. I think it was rather good for it.
Although Thatcher may not have got what she wanted with the funding of the BBC, its battles did not end in 1990. Indeed, the debate over the BBC's funding, independence and political leanings continues today. Boris Johnson's government seriously challenged the BBC and went as far as to freeze the licence fee, something which they argued was designed to ease the cost of living crisis. His government strategy also echoed that of Margaret Thatcher's, as they added Conservative members to the BBC Board of Governors. Another challenge for the broadcaster has been the rise of alternative media and TV channels. Places like GB News offer a direct competitor to the BBC, and ones who are not afraid to heavily criticise it. This also comes at a time when 60% of people feel like the BBC licence fee doesn't represent good value for money, according to YouGov. But what would a world without the BBC actually look like?
Let me say two things. A, there'll be far less jobs in Cardiff and Belfast, and in Strathclyde and in Glasgow, because the BBC is a huge generator of ancillary business. It kind of holds us together as a society. So if you chop the BBC, I think you'd lose social cohesion, which means trusting people on the street. You know, the world's a bit mad. It won't be mad forever. And climate change matters. Those two key issues, almost everybody agrees, were put on the agenda by one public service broadcaster, David Attenborough and the BBC. You don't get Attenborough without the BBC. You don't get the BBC without Attenborough. That public service ethic and interrogation of values and evidence. BBC is responsible at world scale for those. Institutions are very difficult to build. They're very fragile, curiously. And you build them bit by bit and you try and make them strong. They're quite easy to break.
Margaret Thatcher's battle for the BBC was one of the most significant moments in British broadcasting history, and one with which we can draw significant parallels to its current situation. But with public criticism of the BBC seemingly continuing to grow, what could the future of the broadcaster look like?